It's been interesting to listen to the conversations taking place here throughout the morning. And one of the kind of topics that's come up again and again is the need for a collective defense force in addition to NATO as a direct result of, you know, frankly, fear over what could happen in the United States in the coming years as people look at that enormous billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar bill on Ukraine and say, we don't necessarily need to be a part of it. In your mind, do the Europeans need to do more beyond NATO for their own collective defense?
No, I think that some NATO countries need to do more within NATO.
Mm.
And of course, we had the Wales pledge of several years ago, which many countries have not made good on, especially some of them with some of the biggest gross domestic products, in terms of size of their economies. It can make a huge difference in collective defense by investing in their own defense and doing so in a way that's complementary to the overall alliance capabilities. There's a lot more that NATO can do as well in terms of infrastructure, and to be able to ease movement between countries in NATO. So there's a lot of practical work to do within NATO that's complementary to our collective security.
Yeah. One of the big questions continues to be one of logistics. It's wars are won and lost on. And if we look at from Napoleon to Hitler and further on down the line, this is something that has plagued even the most brilliant commanders in the field. And this is something that you can speak to specifically, given your experience. To your mind, when we take a step back and look at all of the threats that the United States could potentially face in the next 10 to 20 years, China comes to mind immediately. We are not today logistically capable of keeping too many or many fronts open as a direct result of logistics. And I'm talking about support vessels, refueling. What does the United States need to do to be battle ready in that sense?
Well, I think you're alluding to really a much broader definition of national security and defense. Beyond just the amount of weapons you have and the size of your forces, it's your defense industrial base. It's what we called in the 2017 National Security Strategy the National Security Innovation Base. Mm-hmm. It has a lot to do with capacity to manufacture munitions, to manufacture equipment and weapons, but it also has a lot to do with supply chains and supply chain resilience. We have become reliant on supply chains that are fragile and that have single points of failure, and many of those single points of failure are in China, for example. So it's immensely important that we learn these lessons now. We expand our defense industrial base. We make the investments we need to invest today because we are so far behind. It's going to take a long time to rectify a lot of these deficiencies.
And speaking of that specifically, I mean, attempting to service the military across all fronts in the Asia Pacific would require significant investment, no, in our maritime fleet.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are commercial capabilities, airlift, sea lift, that are immensely important to national defense. We have certain laws on our books in the United States that actually impede our shipping industry. And I think what we have to do is take a holistic approach to what you might call economic statecraft. We have to understand that we've been under assault by the Chinese Communist Party and the weaponization of its mercantilist statist model against us. And that requires a response. It requires inbound investment screening to ensure that Chinese companies can invest in our companies that have critical technologies for the purpose of extracting those technologies and applying them to the People's Liberation Army. We have to guard against industrial espionage by state actors, China, Russia, and others. We have to screen outbound investments. Hadley, what bothers me more than anything is the degree to which we've been underwriting our own demise with smart money investments in Chinese companies that provide critical capabilities to the People's Liberation Army, as well as the dumb money flows, the index fund flows, where we don't know really where that's going. You've seen the crackdown on any of the companies that are critical to providing transparency. We've seen the employment of export controls in a way that's, I think, effective in connection with semiconductors. But I think we need more of that approach. But I think we need to go offensive with investments in technologies that are critical to the emerging global economy as well as to our national defense. And of course, a lot of this has to do with human capital and so immigration reform, right? So we can bring some of the most talented people into the United States. And what our biggest competitive advantage is that, hey, nobody wants to immigrate to China. Nobody wants to immigrate to Russia. So we should make it easier for the people who we need to come to our country.
I think it's interesting that so often, as you say, investment is really a cornerstone, frankly, of national security. One of the things, obviously, in the last few years that the Biden administration has bought into is the AUKUS agreement, for example, nuclear technology. I know that there's a sharing of nuclear information, and now there are even apparently scientists and those who will be working in that industry in the United States being trained on nuclear technology in order to make that sustainable over the next 10 to 20 years. To your mind, was that a provocation, or was that, frankly, just the bare minimum of what needs to be done in order to secure American interests?
Yeah, I think it's just the bare minimum of what needs to be done. I mean, I think what we need is, we don't want heavy-handed industrial policies, right? We don't want to become like China, but we should incentivize some of the the shifts that are necessary in supply chains to make them more resilient, to make sure that we haven't given the CCP or the Chinese Communist Party coercive power over our economy. And I think in some of these cases, like in semiconductors, the barriers to re-entry into manufacturing are so high, it does require some degree of government assistance. There are other sectors that are like that as well, especially when you consider just battery manufacturing, for example, or actually manufacturing of equipment and hardware critical to the energy transition. Mm-hmm. So if you think about Germany's unwise decision to give coercive power through energy over its economy to Moscow, we're in the danger of making the same mistake with Beijing associated with wind turbines and solar panels and batteries, especially.
Basic rare earth minerals, and who has them, who wants them, and how much one is willing to pay for them.
That's right. That's a good point. I mean, and all the upstream components, including the processes necessary for mineral separation and refinement.
Yeah. When you think about China specifically, to your mind, I mean, given those logistical issues that we've discussed, were there to be a conflict over Taiwan, how would the U.S. fare today?
I think we would be able to fare well in terms of our capabilities that are still really quite relevant to that assault on Taiwan, if that's the form it would take. I think we have to be prepared for a broad range of aggression, though, not only directly around Taiwan, but in the South China Sea and globally. And this is where I think China would be vulnerable. I mean, if China were to try to blockade Taiwan, what if the United States said, well, we're going to have to impede the movement of Chinese shipping through the Straits of Malacca, especially those involving energy security? I mean, I think China has to recognize that, if they take on, if they assault Taiwan, if they lay claim to the ocean in the South China Sea, that there are going to be global ramifications.
And global ramifications for their own economy, because we're talking about trillions of dollars worth of global trade that passes through the South China Sea that would potentially be impeded by any kind of conflict.
Right. If you want to inspect all ships going into Taiwan, maybe we'll have to inspect all Chinese ships going into Long Beach.
Yeah. Think about this from the perspective of perhaps Washington, if you will. You spent time there, so I don't think it's too outside the box to ask you this question. Is there an understanding in Washington, in your mind, of the conflicts we face today? Because there's a lot of navel-gazing and inward-looking debate happening.
No. I think that there's an undervaluing, an underestimation of the degree to which these competitions are interconnected. So, for example, if we look at the competition with Russia, that competition is playing out in the Middle East as well as in Ukraine and the Black Sea region. It's playing out in Southeastern Europe in terms of Russian subversion. It's played out in Georgia, where they've been able to throw an election. It's going to play out in Bulgaria, like it has in Slovakia just in recent weeks and days. So I think it's important for us to look more broadly at these competitions and to recognize that this declared pivot out of the Middle East created a vacuum. Who's taking advantage of that vacuum? Russia, who is enabling the continuation of the Syrian civil war and propping up Assad, enabling Iran to build a land bridge that could threaten Israel and helps Iran continue to support proxy forces in Yemen and in Iraq and perpetuating the cycle of sectarian violence. I mean, Russia essentially now can play the role of both arsonist and fireman in the Middle East. The same thing with China. The supplication to the Iranians in the effort to resurrect a dead nuclear deal, I think has alienated many of our Gulf partners and created a lot of space for China to come in and to create economic relationships and other relationships that they will try to use to diminish American influence in the region.
It's interesting. Another area in which the United States could be said to have been falling behind, in spite of being the innovation nation as we know it, is AI. And I say that in the sense that other countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, with a lot of disposable income, are investing significantly, as is China, into that race. There are questions about, is it good for the United States? Is it good for the world? Bad for humanity? Wherever you fall on that spectrum, it's something that all of us are going to have to deal with going forward. When you look at Elon Musk, first he's involved in Ukraine by providing the Starlink system. Then he decides to stop the use of the Starlink system. How dangerous is it for a private citizen billionaire to have that much influence on the course of world events?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous, but the problem is too when you have large tech companies, successful companies like Musk's companies, that gives them the opportunity to generate a lot of capital and invest in cutting edge technologies. I think when you look at sort of antitrust efforts now in the U.S., we should maybe make sure they really are oriented on antitrust. I mean, you could have said that we should have had antitrust actions against Yahoo, for example, years ago. So I think it's important to recognize that competition still exists. For example, Google seemed insurmountable in terms of search engine until you have Bing Chat and so forth, and now there's this healthy competition. I think you should have the same thing with companies like Elon Musk's, and Elon Musk, I think, should recognize the degree to which it has been a partnership with the U.S. government, especially in connection with SpaceX, that has allowed him in many ways to develop the sort of capabilities he has developed.
Yes.
And private companies should be able to implement policies that constrain our allies and partners internationally.
But as perhaps a military man in the field, the idea that a private citizen is able to dictate whether or not the Ukrainians on the ground have global capability, it's startling. No, I mean, is that something you could have predicted several years ago?
Well, I think so. I mean, you could have predicted it. I think in terms of these companies that have grown so large.
But if we could have predicted it, was it a mistake on the part of policymakers to have allowed such a thing?
Yeah. Well, I'm even more concerned. I'm concerned certainly about the Starlink access and the degree to which it was used to constrain the Ukrainian counteroffensive or targeting into Crimea, for example. But I'm also concerned about the massive investments that U.S. companies are making in China in a way that actually makes our supply chains even more dependent on China. I'm talking about battery manufacturing, and this is Tesla, for example, car manufacturing, but also Ford, and others who have sunk a lot of money into Chinese battery manufacturing. When in fact, I mean, they're just increasing kind of the vulnerability of these critical supply chains, and I think those are bad business decisions. I don't think that there has ever been, I mean, you would know better than I would, a successful business partnership with the Chinese company. I mean, there have been a lot of U.S. companies who've made a lot of money. And they've made a lot of money while driving themselves out of business or greatly diminishing their market share. Mm-hmm. Certainly in China, where they shut it down on you once they pick a Chinese winner, but then also internationally, after those companies enjoy all these subsidies and dump their equipment, and materials and everything else on the international market at an artificially low price, and shut down your market share, internationally.
What about the war on information? We talked about AI. How complicated do you think this is going to get in the coming years?
Yeah, it's going to be extremely complicated, but I think for AI, artificial intelligence related technologies, their application is going to be based on human decisions, obviously. And what's really critical about the competition, I think, is to not constrain our development of artificial intelligence related technologies because others won't do it. So if you have essentially a technology that could be abused or is game-changing, like AI, it is your responsibility to think about how that could be applied in a way that's dangerous to humanity, right, and to our security. But it's also important, not to constrain yourself if there are other parties to that competition with that technology who are not constraining themselves, and that's China in particular.
Yeah. H.R. McMaster, thank you for joining us here at the Warsaw Security Forum.
Thank you, Hadley. Great to be with you.